Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist who covers work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I've written for outlets like The Economist, the BBC, the Washington Post, Quartz, Fast Company, and Digiday's Work Life, and I'll be your host today. This webinar is being officially hosted by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. Attuned shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker and communicate more effectively, which in turn reduces employee turnover, drives engagement, productivity, and innovation, increases psychological safety, and ultimately builds happier, more successful organizations. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how employers can recruit and retain Gen Z talent. This is the youngest generation in the labor force today, and they're also the most diverse to date. This is a generation of workers characterized by their sense of individualism, entrepreneurialism, and their sense of justice. Yet, to what extent are employers relying on stereotypes to understand and cater to Gen Z? And how can we skip the shortcuts and take the time to understand what workers really want and what they really need? Our panelists will help us understand that today. So I'm joined by Giselle Batley, Director of Early Career Recruitment and Development, who's currently working in the media and tech space. Ivan H. Lee, a DEI consultant with more than 15 years of experience at Fortune 100 companies, including Apple and T-Mobile. And Chloe Callahan, senior reporter at Work Life and host of Digiday's The Return podcast. We'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A with our panelists. So as we go along, if you have any questions for the group, either as a whole or individually, don't hesitate to put those in the comments or the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So to kick things off before we get to, before I start asking our panelists some questions, I'd like to ask our audience one. Today we'll be doing some myth busting about Gen Z workers. So I'd like to know from the audience, what comes to mind when you think about working with Gen Z? So for example, are they tech savvy, social media obsessed? Are they hard to retain, or do they lack loyalty to their employers? Somebody I saw said flighty, so that is certainly one stereotype we heard. And sometimes, I'm sure we all have worked with flighty young people. Are they dedicated to social justice? Maybe they're expert multitaskers. Maybe they're really good at just standing up for what they believe in and fighting for other people. If there are any others that come to mind, please do put them in the chat. We'd love to hear what they are. So let's get to meeting our panelists. I'd like for each of you to introduce yourselves very briefly, just to tell us more about what you do in your job and a little bit about how you got there. So we'll start with Giselle.
Sure. So a little bit about me. Gosh. So I've been in the early talent / recruitment / DE&I space for over 12 years. I actually started my career in sales, and back then what we called multicultural marketing, which I think is now more like DE&I marketing, and experiential, and decided that I wanted to move to recruiting. And mainly because at the time, I was the millennial in the workforce. And so we were the hot topic back then. And, at the time I was the only millennial on my team. I was the youngest, the only woman, the only person of color, and decided that, I want to make a difference. And so I started raising my hand to help with campus recruiting and have not looked back. So I've been in this space. I nerd out a lot on Gen Z and the best ways to attract really the next generation. I'm already looking at Gen Alpha now and kind of what some of those trends are and what's driving them. So that's a little bit about me. I'm in Louisiana, live in the New Orleans area, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for being here, Giselle. It's always nice to work with you. Ivan, coming to us from the West Coast of the US.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Ivan H. Lee, and my pronouns are he, him, and I help people and organizations find and fulfill their purpose so they can thrive. And I do this by creating environments where people bring their best selves to work or have the ability to do so. And I've done this at companies like Apple and T-Mobile and Elastic. I'm based out of Seattle, Washington, a little rainy today, as typical. And I am as Giselle was talking about Generation Alpha, I'm raising two Generation Alpha sons, so I'm in the throes of understanding what the dynamics are going to be like for them, and also creating the environment where they can thrive when they enter the workforce. So I'm very excited about this topic today.
Thanks, Ivan. Happy you're here. And last but not least, Chloe joining us from the Hudson Valley in New York State.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am super excited to be here. I am the Gen Zer on the call today. I graduated into the pandemic in 2020, so I'm like fitting that mold exactly. So I'm excited to speak a little bit about what I've experienced myself, and then also other Gen Zers that I see personally and then report on. So as mentioned, I am Digiday Media's work-life senior reporter, and I cover all things future of work. So we write a ton on Gen Z and how different generations work together, but then also a lot of other things around culture, talent, leadership, spaces, D&I, and technology. So I'm super excited to be here today. Thank you.
I love how you are also uniquely qualified to be here in different ways. So I think this is going to be a really good conversation. All right, let's get started. I want to start with the story of Gen Z. I don't want to pretend that we can sum up an entire generation of people in a few sentences, but let's try. Let's give it the really high level. So I'm interested in the social, political, and economic events that have shaped this generation. Actually, I want to go to Chloe first on this one because I listened to a recent episode of The Return in which you covered this specifically. So tell us about the environment in which you and your peers graduated into the workforce and how that's shaped your experience.
Yeah, definitely. So as the host of season 2 of The Return, a podcast that we did all about Gen Z entering the workforce, our first episode was their origin story. So what really happened to them to kind of impact how they work today? And that starts as early as being born around 9/11 and then entering school where, they're seeing their parents go through a recession and maybe that's impacting them. And then later on in their school years, it's a time of mass shootings. Like even me myself having to experience that, and 30 minutes away, the Sandy Hook shooting was for me. And okay, how is that impacting what my life was like in high school at the time, but then later on moving through the rest of my life and then work. And so from there, it's graduating from college into a global pandemic. And all while that's happening, there's climate change. We're seeing these headlines of fires, burning, floods, earthquakes in New York City, all these things that are just wild to grasp. And I think a lot of it has made us say, okay, how are we going to work how generations did in the past, where all they thought about was, maybe the bottom line or bigger business. Now we're very much like, these things are happening and we feel like we want to have an impact. We want to do something. And like I said, as I introed myself, I graduated into the pandemic in 2020. And so right from that moment, I was like, all right, I feel like we know this is not going to be a typical work experience. Things are going to be a lot different. I've had all these experiences that have shaped me while growing up. And when I enter the workforce now, I'm going to just have a different checklist than probably other generations.
Ivan, when we spoke before, you had a lot to say. You've been thinking about this deeply, all the diversity of experience that folks in this generation are going to bring to the workforce. What would you add?
Yes, I totally agree with what Chloe mentioned about the expectations that she has coming into the workforce. And I also want to add that there are 3 key macro factors that I've been observing. The first is the access to information. There has more access to information than ever. And I want to add that recently I've been reading a book called Stolen Focus by Johan Johari. And he writes that this distractedness, this desire for multiple inputs into our lives that's mostly attributed to the newer generations is not necessarily a function of technology, but it's actually a function of the increased access to information, which of course is abated by technology. So I want to share that is a huge macro environment that we operate in, and that also contributes to people's expectation of transparency. Pay transparency. There's Glassdoor. There's salary and trackers. So companies have to be a lot more transparent because the information is out there. The second macro factor I see is delayed traditional milestones, parenthood, home ownership, traditional marriage or partnerships. And a factor in this is actually the disproportionate cost increase compared to the average income. If you track the increase of income, real dollars over the last 15 years compared to the costs, right, inflation and all that stuff, we're in a very sad and unprecedented time of rising costs. And this macro environment is countered only by the availability of the gig economy and new ways of making money. And I remember in a recent, NPR special, journalist Fareed Zakaria was talking about the availability of gig working being really what's bolstering a lot of the economy. Basically, even people who have full-time jobs are participating in these other methods to bolster their lack of real spending power as compared to previous generations. So that's a very big aspect. And the third macro focus I would have is that Gen Z seems to have a greater awareness and also greater anxiety about issues like climate change, around social justice, mental health, and of course, diversity, equity, inclusion. And that means that they demand that employers, A, have a position on these issues, and then B, have a very clear policy on how they, as employees, can express concerns about these issues, especially if they are in conflict with the organization's position. So those are three trends that I see.
Giselle, I'm curious to know what the most significant misunderstandings that you see when it comes to Gen Z and their career preferences and desires. I've seen a couple people mention it in the chat, and I've seen this in my own reporting.
Oh, yeah.
This notion that they're flaky or flighty, which may be the case for anybody who's 22 years old. I was that way when I was 22. I think that's just a natural way to be when you're young and totally fine. What misunderstandings do you see about this generation?
Yeah, and look, you can't put an entire generation into one box, right? You talk about just intersectionality and all the different ways they identify. So that's just one thing. Let's start there. You might very well see some people that appear to be flighty. But I do think one thing you have to remember too is what are they fleeing from, right? So we talk about what their values are, what they care about. So maybe they are flighty in your environment that as it exists today, right? And hopefully you're continuing to educate yourself on what's important to this generation. So I think, flighty, maybe. Let's look at your environment. Sometimes it's like I tell everyone, hold the mirror up, right? And let's look at that piece first. But secondly, I think that is the biggest misconception, is that they aren't going to stay with an organization. That was the same conversation with millennials. And I think the biggest thing is, millennials, we looked for growth and opportunity. And so we also were a product of one generation creating the next. We looked at boomers, we looked at Gen Xers and saw, wow, they got laid off after 20 years of loyalty. Well, what does loyalty mean anymore? Right. And so I think the biggest thing is now it's, okay, let me take care of me. I want to grow. If I'm not growing, then I'm going to leave. And so I think that's nothing for organizations to be afraid of. It's how do we build in measures to make sure that we are continuously growing, creating value. We are understanding that each generation is slightly different, but again, a lot of that is based on what they saw. Just like you said, Ivan, I'm raising, this generation, right? So like you created them. And I have to remind myself, I'm raising Gen Alpha too. And shoot, what I do and what they see in my everyday work life, it's going to be either what they run from or run to. And so we're creating that environment. So I think that's a big thing. And so when they talk about lacking loyalty, I think you have to create that space for them to feel comfortable. They look for mission-driven work. And I know we'll probably talk a little bit about that too, but that is important. And I think there was actually a stat from Veris Insights that talked about that, especially if they start as interns and if they start early, right, they feel more loyalty and connection to that company. So it's okay to invest in interns. And I'm always preaching that story too, because obviously I'm in early talent recruiting. But it is really important that you can shape their loyalty to your brand, to your company through those first experiences that you have. And they were actually almost nearly, I think it was nearly 40% more likely to stay for a 5-year period if they start with your organization earlier on in their career. So that's actually quite opposite to what we're hearing with the whole flightiness, which is not always true. There's always some that'll beat the stats, but I would not box in the full generation. And I'm trying to think, anything else. I think, we talk about them being maybe more motivated by financial gain. Being not motivated by financial gain. And I think there is some truth to that. They are mission driven, but they want to grow, right? Like they want to move quickly. They don't want to be stifled. And so I do think it is important that if you that you do have pay transparency. Ivan, you touched on that a little bit too, right? They want to know. And I'm finding, just as I've been in this space for a while, they're communicating, they're sharing salaries amongst each other. Well, what are you making? What were you offered? Right. And like, why is that the case? And though that's not fair. Right. And so I think, that's another area for organizations to, I would say, look out for and be careful about. But also know that like, that's not necessarily their motivator, but they're more motivated around the fairness of it. Right. And are we doing the right thing? Are we being transparent? Are we treating all of our employees equitably? So yeah, those are just a few things that come to mind for that.
Chloe, what would you add about this notion that young people are disloyal to their employers, super motivated by or unmotivated by financial gain? What's your read on that?
Yeah, I would say I agree with Giselle. It definitely is not this broad stroke. It really depends. There's people in my life that I see that they want that growth. They want to have really good salaries. They're really driven by that. Some of them also love having a typical 9 to 5, which a lot of people, like, again, there's this stereotype that Gen Zers don't want that at all. But even a Harris poll that came out yesterday, it found that Gen Z is the cohort that wants to work from home the least. So that's actually the baby boomers, they were at the highest. And a lot of that is, with the baby boomers, 37% of them said that. So I feel like, right, like Gen Zers, we like graduated into the pandemic. We didn't have that exact mentorship or guidance. So it kind of makes sense where some Gen Zers are saying, no, I do want to be in the office. I do want a 9 to 5. I do want guidance. I do want to hit these marks. I want to push myself. I want to be at a maybe great company with this huge name or whatever it might be. So I think it really depends on the certain case, and it is more not the stereotype, right? Like everyone thinks like, oh, they want remote, they want to be able to do whatever they want, be flexible. But when they're shaping their career, they know that they need some help there. And sometimes that might come from a company that is more of a better name. Like I know that another one of the questions that we talked about is kind of, do they want to be at these high pressure name brand employers? And a report from Handshake found that employer reputation does play a key role in graduating seniors' application decisions, where we're reading the reviews, like Ivan mentioned before, like Glassdoor, Indeed, all these things, blind, even what's the conversation on LinkedIn or Twitter about a company, or asking friends who have worked there or had family members who work there. We're definitely doing that. And I think that then goes back into, do we want to work for a company that has certain missions or, what their corporate social responsibility is, things like that. So I think we care a lot more than people say or show for Gen Z. We really are hardworking and want to kind of prove ourselves. And I think that we have that feeling a little bit that millennials probably had when they were our age. And it's just that grind that it's not so much the stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, because Chloe, you just reminded me of something. There was a stat from NACE that was saying that Gen Z is, 72% of Gen Z in the workforce that were surveyed said that they are very willing to work hard, if not outwork other generations. And so I think that was another stereotype, is that, oh, they're flighty, they don't want to work hard, right? Actually, no. But again, it's like, what are you asking them to do, right? Like, are they tied to that mission? Is it something that they care about or identify with? So I think, again, it's like we're trying to box them into the work environment as it exists, as we know might not work for them, right? So if you get that formula right, they are absolutely willing to work hard, they're still going to want that flexibility. So work hard does not mean extra hours, right? It could be, I'm going to be very focused, right? So I think that's another piece too. But you just reminded me of that, Chloe. And I think absolutely you cannot say that this is not a generation that is going to work hard.
I love all the conversation that's going on in the chat. So you guys, audience, I'm loving this participation. So keep going. Well, let's talk about that. Giselle, you said, what are you asking them to do? Are you helping them see the mission that you're delivering? So something I've heard from recruiters and HR leaders that I speak to is that Gen Z is really only interested in jobs that are meaningful and interested in working for employers who share their values. And for instance, that they're so principled that they'll leave companies if they aren't aligned in political beliefs and social beliefs and that kind of thing. To what extent do you think this is true? Chloe, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that it really depends. I know for season 2 of The Return, we did speak to some people who said, I'm not even going to join this kind of company that the values aren't aligned. So we spoke to someone who she actually was a vegan and she got a really great job offer from someone in the meat industry. And she ended up saying, I just cannot take this role, even though like the pay was there. It was great, but she said, I can't do it. So we hear that story a lot. And it definitely happens that people are even willing to take a lower paying job. That was one thing we really kept asking our Gen Zers on season 2 of The Return. Like, where is the line? Like, will you take a job that maybe you don't align with if you're getting that much money? But they're okay with taking a lower payer job from what we found, as long as it is meaning that it's aligned with their values and that sort of thing. So it is really interesting. And that's backed by, also want to hit on this handshake data again, that found that the class of 2024 is applying to fewer tech jobs and more government jobs, which also kind of shows me that they're choosing probably more like, how can I help versus, okay, money, money, money. So that signaled that for me as well. But overall, I think that missions are super important values of a company. And if they end up joining a company that they think that it's aligned, and then they start seeing these hints of, oh, wow, like maybe it's not, maybe they don't recognize their best workers, maybe they don't have a psychologically safe environment, maybe they're stating something publicly about one event happening, but another, they're kind of keeping their mouth closed. So once those things start happening, I think, all right, that's when their eyes start to wander somewhere else for sure.
Mm-hmm. Something that Gen Z has brought to working life is a desire for equity and fairness. And I think millennials did this to a certain extent, but Gen Z is very outspoken. So Ivan, what advice do you have for employers who are intimidated by a young demographic that is unafraid to speak out when they don't agree with something that the company is doing?
Well, first, I love the story that Chloe shared about the vegan who turned down the offer at the, I guess, the animal-based meat organization. I would say there's a lot of organizations that are now turning to plant-based meats. So maybe that's the direction that person wanted to go toward. I have tried Impossible Burger and it's pretty good as a meat lover myself. I would say that it's having a very clear employer and leadership brand is number one. And I think companies are finding out that they need strong internal communications and external communication teams to coach on what aspects of a C-suite leader's position are aligned with the companies and should be promoted. Because if you look at just the growth in the generations that are staffing leadership positions, a lot of millennials and Gen Xers are in C-suite positions right now. So that means they are personally very outspoken on certain issues. And the company as an entity, especially if they're publicly traded, must be very careful as to is the leader speaking on behalf of the company, or are they speaking on behalf of themselves? So that's number one. And then number two, on the employee side, we have to have a very clear and transparent policy around communicating personal positions. right? This view is my own. It's in no ways reflective of the organization I'm working with, and or here's a way that you can disagree respectfully with the organization. So the key here is clarity and transparency about how you engage in this discourse.
Let's talk about the notion of employer branding. This is something that I've reported on myself. I find it very interesting that now there is the expectation that employers provide a customer grade employee experience. And that really starts with marketing the company as an employer. So from the audience members, I'd love to know if employer branding is a part of your recruitment strategy, and maybe to what extent. Are you just starting this? Is this been a part of your recruitment plan for some time? So yeah, please put that in the chat because I would like to know. Giselle, this is something that you have done. You've been working in early career development. You've been on campuses talking to young people, millennials and Gen Zers. So in addition to being acquisition professionals, now have to be marketers. It's a whole new skill set that a lot of them have had to learn, and some are even bringing in teams to do this. How do you market an employer to this current young demographic, Gen Z? What formats are you using? What messages do you find resonate most with them?
So this is, I could probably go on for a long time about this because it's an evolving space, as you know. And I think what we're finding is social media is key, and social, and I won't just say like what you traditionally think of your LinkedIn, Instagram, like things like that. TikTok, which now, I think it's getting mixed reviews from Gen Z. Like they want to hear career advice on TikTok, but they don't necessarily want you to start like advertising to them on there. So Chloe, correct me if I'm wrong there. But we have seen, and I would say especially the last 5 or 6 years, the rise of like true recruitment marketing teams sitting within kind of the recruitment space and really focusing on understanding the trends and understanding how to speak to them. But I would say transparency is key. You have to be transparent and authentic, right? You can't pretend to be, and I'm just going to use DE&I as an example. You can't pretend to be a company that is premier in DE&I if you aren't, because this is a generation that will call you out on it. And I've seen in sessions and now just in campus visits, right? I've seen this where students will just completely ask, well, I looked at your website and I noticed that you don't have any leaders that reflect this, but I hear you saying X. Make that story match for me, right? And they will say that. And so I think, you just have to be authentic and say, we're not exactly where we want to be, but here's where we are on our journey. And here are some of the things that we're doing, right? And so I think just being open about that, preparing your recruiters to tackle those questions, which again, in the past, that would have never come up. In fact, I would say, and I'm just going to use me as a millennial, I won't put everyone in a box. I might have been terrified to ask that question to a leader or to a recruiter. Not Gen Z and not what I've seen. And so I think preparing your teams to answer those tough questions. So we're working, and I've seen like internally, we're working with comms and we're working with all of these different groups to make sure we have our messaging correct. I think beyond authenticity, transparency, flexibility is important. And I'll sum it up by saying Gen Z works to live, but they don't live to work, right? And so it's how can work empower what I want to do outside of work versus I change what I do outside of work to give myself more time to work. And so I think, that's really important that you need to talk about what ways are we providing our employees with flexibilities? How are we fueling their personal passions, right? Like, do we have benefits that can help them with their personal passions? I remember probably the most revolutionary thing back in my day was like companies offering pet insurance. That was like a new thing, right? But like now that's more of a standard benefit, fortunately. So I think, what ways are you like encouraging them to have a healthy like home life? Do you hear that? My dog is barking. And so, but how are you empowering them to have a healthy home life, pursue their passions, any benefits you have that help them pursue their personal health? I heard you mention just even like their mental well-being. That's important. What benefits are you offering that lean into that piece as well? Psychological safety. So I think those are all things that you need to be able to highlight. Your recruiting teams now have to be trained to highlight that, to answer those questions. And I guess to summarize, there are teams now being formed and built really focused on that recruitment marketing space.
Don't knock pet insurance until you try it, which I know you were not knocking it, Giselle.
Clearly, I'm using it.
Yeah, my husband and I, we have 2 senior dogs and just signed up for pet insurance, and it's been a great decision, and it's offered through his employer. So I highly recommend that, especially for folks who, I hear employers are finding ways to support people who don't have a traditional family setup, meaning like no kids or kids out of the house, just finding new ways. It's not all about parental leave necessarily, that they have other creatures in their house that they want to support. Chloe, you brought up Handshake a couple of times, and I would imagine a lot of people on this call are familiar with Handshake as a platform, but if you could tell us a little bit more about what that is and who it caters to. And I'd also like to know from you, do you think the job board is a destination for Gen Z job seekers, or is it social? Do they want the on-campus visits? What do you see?
Yeah, so Handshake is a college job board, so a #1 way for college students to find jobs. But again, something else that we talked about in season 2 of The Return was, where are they finding these jobs? And kind of is out with the job boards. I know that Giselle mentioned TikTok, and it isn't this direct branding of like, oh, we're here, we're on TikTok, but it is these like low-key ways. Like, one person we spoke to for the podcast, she saw that someone was just talking about their company casually in a TikTok video, and then was like, oh, like, by the way, like, we're hiring. And that's how she found her job. She was like, oh, no way. So she saw the job on TikTok and then went over to LinkedIn and was like, oh yeah, like, this sounds great. She applied and she got the job. And it's funny, whenever you apply to a job, it asks that question, where did you hear about this? And we joked, there's no drop down in the menu yet for TikTok, but I think that it definitely is happening more and more on social, where how are these conversations happening naturally? What companies are being spoken about? And also, like, work talk has taken off. We even made a whole TikTok trend watch section because people are talking about their jobs so much on TikTok, whether that's a day in the life or it's salary transparency. This is how much I'm getting paid in these industries, or career advice, like for the Gen Zers or younger generations who are entering the workforce and maybe don't know about what they should have on their resume or interview tips or whatever it might be. And I will say that we found that this is also especially helpful because it's more of a free source. You're getting great information and you can access it without having to maybe pay someone to help you or whatever it might be. So it is really helpful. And I think that a lot more people are going towards this way. Of course, not leaving behind LinkedIn entirely or other traditional job boards, but it really is a combination. And also it's nice because when maybe you're just getting your regular entertainment, you're getting kind of tips and tricks on how to help you in your work life at the same time. So it's nice.
I have to chime in on that. So, and hopefully he simmered down now. And everyone, you heard it here first, the rise of the corporate influencer. It is a thing. It is a thing. And even Handshake is now building in a feed, right? Where you can have your team and others like post content that students can see in their feeds. But that's a thing. And, again, I've actually seen now people making careers out of training recruiters to become that influencer, and also encouraging employees to post, use hashtags, life at X company, right? Like, that is becoming the thing. So absolutely. And again, they want that to still feel more authentic, right? So it can't look too staged, because I've also seen now some TikToks making fun of companies that have very staged postings. So I think, you have to make sure that the content is natural. But yes, that's the new wave now too. It's just how many different ways can you get your brand and your employees in front of the students, because that's what they want to see.
I'm curious, what do you think is motivating Gen Z to talk so openly about their jobs on social media? I would be horrified to do this. I do some self-promotion because I'm a reporter and I do want people to see what I write. But sharing my personal experience at work is horrifying to me. I'm kind of a private person. I'm not a digital native. So, Chloe, what do you think is motivating people to? There was the famous instance of the girl filming herself being laid off and then sharing that on social media. Why do you think Gen Z is doing this?
Yeah. So another thing we joked about is how when you first would get a job for maybe millennials or older, you would go through your whole Facebook, make sure there's no red Solo cups, make sure that it was pin tight and that they could see no peek into your actual life. And now that is so different. People are open about how they are on social media. They share who they are. And it really goes back to bringing your full self to work. And I think that's what it is for them, where they want to be at a company where people are aligned, personalities are aligned, and that you can bring your authentic self there. So I think that that's a big part of it. And the transparency is what makes it possible. They're okay with saying, this is who I am. If a company wants me, great. If they don't, all right, I'm on to the next. And that goes back to their loyalty and whether or not that's how thin that is. But I really think it is about they're okay with being completely authentic. They like sharing their lives. They have so many side hustles. A lot of their side hustles are related to social media. And it just, that's the story for them, really.
Can I just say, Chloe, I love that for us. Like, I love that for all of us. And even though I know, Emily, it makes you uncomfortable, right? The thing is, they are forcing organizations to change how we view those things. Where in the past, it was like, you do not refer to your job on social media. You do not talk about these things. You don't share your salary. You don't share, they're
Grounds for
forcing.
dismissal in the past. Yeah.
Yes. Like, can you imagine though, right now being legal teams in some of these companies? Because yes, to them, it might be a nightmare, but the truth is like, this is not going anywhere and you're not going to be able to convince or necessarily mute a generation that has grown up in this social media space. And so I think they're forcing a lot of positive change on the workplace and I love it. I'm excited for what it's going to create for all of us.
Absolutely. I want to double click on both Chloe and Giselle. That it's, not only can you not mute, but you might get canceled in the process. So you got to be careful of that. And speaking of transparency, I think one of the reasons why people are more apt to speak up is because of two things. One, there's no hiding. As digital natives, everything is transparent. You're basically not able to delete those red Solo cup pictures like the previous generations because there's just too many of them, perhaps. And then the second, I think, is related to psychological safety because of the availability of information, of personal information in the interwebs, right? That your life is already out there. It's already a known given that you accept. There's also then it enables the removal of masking, which is a term from the neurodivergent community, but it really also applies to what corporate workers have been doing for decades, which is not showing up as themselves in the workplace. They mask. They present as X, Y, and Z, but now they're not masking in their digital life. Why should they mask in their workplace? And because of that, that presents the opportunity for change because it's not an option, right? It's no longer an option to mask, and that forces organizations to have to respond to that. And I totally agree with you, Giselle. It's a great thing that organizations must respond because this is how the workplace gets better. This is how the workplace adapts. And the companies that are adapting to this, that are ahead of this curve, they're the ones that are going to succeed. So listen, right? This is a business opportunity too.
Something that I think this use of social media has cultivated, and what I envy, is a sense of confidence. So for instance, a couple weekends ago, my husband and I were having coffee. It was outdoors. It was this kind of chic little coffee shop. And a young woman, I'm going to guess she was a late college student, came with her. She was having coffee alone, came with her camera, set it up on a stand, and posed in front of the coffee shop with her coffee. And yes, everyone was watching, but she didn't care. And I thought, we're just sort of elbowing each other in the ribs. And I told my husband, I was like, what would it be like to have that level of confidence? I would like to take a picture of myself in front of this coffee shop. I would be far too self-conscious to do so. And so the fact that she was alone, was able to stand there and do it, and then goes back to her computer and edits her photos, probably posts it and makes money off of it. I envied the confidence. And I think that that's a really nice quality that that this generation has developed. Something else, and I can't remember who brought it up, maybe Ivan or Chloe, this how common gig work is. I've spoken to university professors who were teaching Gen Z, and I asked about their career expectations. And one of them told me that they don't expect their 9-to-5 job, if that's what it is, to be their only job. Gig work might be a necessary part for financial reasons, but also for personal reasons. They want to have something that they want to pursue on the side. So this sense of entrepreneurialism is very strong. And I think that's also admirable. Ivan, how do you think employers can cater to this inclination for individualism, entrepreneurialism, when they really have to be employed by someone?
It's really about how work and rewards are structured. So in a corporate space, if you think about the basic exchange, and that's occurring, you're trading time for money, and you're trading particular types of time outcomes, right? What is your work product? What is the what are you doing with that time? And you have this, the organization has to structure the incentives correctly. So one way of addressing this inclination for independence and entrepreneurism is project-based work. So making sure that instead of you're focused on this is your title and this is the job responsibilities that come with your title, instead you are perhaps you're a team player that is able to work on multiple projects. So you're almost kind of deconstructing the job role and thinking about the role beyond this title and beyond these are your daily responsibilities, and thinking about these are the projects that you could be working on. That's really attractive to the younger generations. And I think to a lot of older generations as well, project-based work. The second is rewards for innovation. So a lot of the tech companies, they offer substantive bonuses for patents. If you get a patent while at an organization, you basically get a bonus equal to your annual salary, because of the the equitable value that comes with that patent that you have now assigned to the organization you work with. There's another reward could be not just traditionally be, oh, if you do something amazing, you get access to leadership. And while that's great because you're being listened to, you also have to add the ability for your new ideas to come to life in new products. So that when workers hear the stories and when they see, oh, wow, this person spoke up, this person found an error, this person found a new efficient way of doing something, and they got rewarded for doing so, that also satisfies that entrepreneurial and independent desire in their minds. So it's about project-based work and rewards for innovation.
I wanted to say, like, that's really nice to hear, because I have heard from a lot of Gen Zers who feel that they're forced into being an entrepreneur or having to have side hustles, where if their actual company had provided things like you just mentioned, or had paid them really well, they probably wouldn't be having to make profits off their side hustles. They would be able to just make art because they love making art, or keep writing because they love writing, and not to actually have to make more money to pay their bills. And that goes back to what you said at the top of this call too, where everything is pushed back for us. We can't afford to buy houses. We really, like, even getting married and having kids, that's like costs so much money. So that's being pushed back, all these other things. And it really reminds me, I talked to one person who said that this is very common amongst, he went through this where he had to choose, he didn't get to choose to be an entrepreneur. He felt like he was forced into starting his own job and his own company, a consultancy, because that was the only route. He was, when he graduated in, I think 2020 or 2021, he was promised a job at a company, but they kept pushing that back. So in that time, he didn't have, work to do. So what else is he going to do to make money except start his own company? Oh, and that's kind of a common story for a lot of people. They feel like, to make money, I need to figure it out myself. And it would be nice if employers could step up and offer benefits and offer more money and things like that, so that people can just truly enjoy their side hustles.
Giselle, what would you add? I saw you nodding your head.
So a couple things, and I think it doesn't necessarily address the additional income, so I will recognize that piece. But I've seen some organizations get really creative with allowing their employees to have that entrepreneurial spirit or entrepreneurial, where they will put out a problem statement. Look, here's a challenge that our company is working on. Because what you have to remember, just because you work in one function doesn't mean you don't have a skill set elsewhere, right? Like I'm in HR, but I geek out on AI, and I'm like even considering just like taking some courses to learn how to more effectively use it because I just love it. And so what they would do is put out a problem statement and say, come with a pitch. How would you solve this? Like, and then they would actually do like I don't know, like a hackathon type session where if you have the best pitch, no matter what role you work in, you get an opportunity to work on this project and we will give you a budget to bring it to life. And so those things are super creative because it gives you a chance to still, focus on your day job, obviously, but then like, maybe venture out into something else, but still in the same company. And companies benefit from that. So I think that's really cool. I saw that. I didn't get to see it all the way through, so I'm not sure how it landed, but I thought that was just a genius idea. And another thing is there are some tools that exist, and I'm in recruiting, so we hear about a lot of tools and we get pitched a lot of tools now with AI that can help match talent. And there was one in particular that stood out to me where it also not only matches talent from your database, but it surfaces your internal talent that has those skill sets as well. And so I think a lot of times when you work in massive organizations, you don't even know, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and you don't even know where else you might be qualified, right? And so there are tools that now say, hey, this person who works in HR might actually be qualified for this business facing position. I just made that up, but like it helps do that. And so I think those are other things that, will help feed the entrepreneurial spirit, but also just that spirit of like growth and just new opportunities that right now people might feel boxed in.
I want to note that we've gotten some really good questions in the chat. So I'd like for you guys to address one of them. Erica asked for suggestions for those who don't follow the traditional, I guess it's not even traditional, just to follow the college path. Giselle, I saw you responded to that. Did you have something in mind when Erica asked that question?
And repeat that again. So sorry, I was reading one of the comments in the chat, so I missed the first part of it.
Okay. No problem. Erica said, I'd love to hear some suggestions for those who don't follow the college path. And I saw you responded to that in the chat. So did you have something in mind when she said that?
Yes, because, and so again, I've been in this sort of, I guess, more traditional university space, which we're also starting to challenge that now because college enrollment has been declining. And I think that's like been steady over the past 5 years that the numbers continue to go down and people are choosing alternative paths, going straight into boot camps, for example, or going into other certificate programs, which honestly are more cost effective. And guess what? You can have the same value of a career in most cases. And so I think, and I'm not sure, Erica, and maybe you can put in the chat just to clarify what you mean around, options for them. But I would say that companies are paying attention to that. I've been in this space for a while. You'll see that teams are now dropping the university recruiting title, and it's more of like early talent, emerging talent. And that is purposeful that you see a lot of recruiting teams moving that way because yes, it's not just about recruiting talent off of universities. That's still a very key part of our strategy, but we should be looking at other spaces. We should be looking at those returning to the workforce, maybe those who took a period of time off, like working moms, for example. I've partnered with Mom Project in the past on getting some moms to return to the workforce, or those who are maybe 2 to 3 years into one field and decide they want to switch industries, right? That's still emerging talent that's looking to go into a new industry. So I will say talent acquisition teams are looking at that. We are constantly talking more about skills-based recruiting versus credentials and all of those things that traditionally we used to use as benchmarkers for finding talent. So that space is evolving. Would I say, 100% of organizations are there yet? Not quite, but I would say over the last 2 to 3 years, you've probably noticed on job descriptions where a degree was required or certain things were required, those things are now being removed. And that is for a reason. So hopefully, Erica, that covers your question, but let us know if there was anything else you wanted to cover there.
We've had a couple more come in through the Q&A function. One attendee asks, how is leadership vulnerability viewed from internal perspectives? It'd be great if you could maybe offer some, and when you say leadership vulnerability, could you maybe tell us more about what you mean? 'Cause I'd definitely like to address that question. In the spirit of that, maybe this is what you're getting at. Chloe, Gen Zers are graduating into their first management jobs around now. What skills and characteristics do you think that this generation is going to uniquely bring to management roles?
Yeah, so I think that it will hopefully be what they're wanting to see. So once they get to management, they kind of finally have the chance to say, all right, let me make a difference here. And I think that some of those key skills and characteristics will be kind of a level of understanding and really being able to create a psychologically safe environment, being able to be a little bit more casual. Things don't need to be so to the books and so like serious all the time. I feel like we bring a level of like, okay, like let's lighten things up. Even like people say our email signatures are a little bit more out of pocket compared to the best or thanks or whatever. Happy to have people take PTO and also understand mental health and being happy with flexibility and people taking time to do what they need and kind of being more focused on the outcome versus, okay, what are the hours? How long is someone's butt in a seat? Things like that. For our TikTok trend watch that I mentioned earlier, we spoke to the corporate baddie, which some of you may or may not know on TikTok, but his name is DeAndre Brown. And he told us that because he has a skit now of the Gen Z manager and how he portrays it. And he gets his insights from some of his friends who are in management positions as Gen Zers already and through his consultancy. And he explained to me during a Q&A that it's really this level of like being a little bit more chill and understanding and that things aren't going to always be the way that they were. And a lot of this, again, was made possible by the millennials who are in management positions now. And it's funny on those skits, it's just like, oh, I have to take off 2 weeks. And then the manager that's a Gen Zer is like, all right, no problem. Like, we'll figure it out. And people are like, where can I want to work here. Like, I want to be a part of this. So a lot of it is maybe an exaggeration, but hopefully I do think that some of those skills will just be that deeper level of understanding overall. And also adaptability, willing to try new things and experiment and being okay with pivoting so quickly. I feel like that's all we've done our entire lives with like our origin story that I mentioned at the top of this panel. And yeah, kind of bring that all into the workforce.
We have another attendee who asks about generational gaps. I think, Ivan, this would be a great question. I'm going to throw this one your way. This person writes, how have you seen companies bridge generational gaps among employees? For example, sales folks who have a long tenure frustrated with early career employees, with their attitudes, with maybe not understanding how to communicate or not knowing what the other side is doing. What advice would you have for them?
I have two thoughts to that. First, who is not potentially frustrated at new colleagues? This is not a generational question. This is more about, hey, you have a new colleague, they're not familiar with the company, period. It's not an age issue. It's like, oh, maybe they don't know the systems, right? They need to learn the systems. So having clear expectations and reasonable expectations about helping your new colleague first and foremost. So I would say kind of check yourself on how you're perceiving your frustration at your new colleague or wherever they are in their career. So I think that's a universal issue that's not limited to this particular generation. It's just part of the story of life of new and newer and less new workers working together. And then second, I would say organizations that have set up a consistent pipeline of talent over the last couple of decades means that so if you're at a growing company, then you're going to be able to weather the storm much better because you have multi-generations in the workplace that can smooth out some of these translation difficulties. So I think that's number one. But if I would say for organizations that are just thinking about this and maybe they have huge gaps, maybe they only have Gen Xers and then Gen As, right? Because they've forgot to or haven't thought about making sure there's a consistent growth path for folks in the company, then they're going to have a lot more concerns and troubles. And I would say there's a lot more work that's needed to translate, to make sure to fill leadership positions with people that look more like their customers and look more like their target audience. That's very important, because if you look at the website and you look at the C-suite, you look at the board, and your images or descriptions and life experiences that are described are nothing like the talent that you're attracting, then of course you're going to be frustrated because you have a different set of culture and expectations. So that's a big deal.
The attendee who asked about leadership vulnerability replied, and they said, I think panel members took a stab at where I was getting to. What they have seen is that in exit interviews, there were comments about leaders not being human enough or seen as maybe unfeeling. And they write, I guess that's why Gen Z are seen as flighty, but it might be because leaders are not well versed in dealing with new ways. I think that's a pretty good summation of some things that all of you have said during our discussion today. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to keep going with a few questions because I would really like to hear your answers. When Gen Zers imagine their future careers, what do they see? I know that's a really broad question. Chloe, I'd like for you to take a stab at it. Maybe help us understand the way that they're envisioning their careers.
Yeah, I think hopefully just at a place that understands them and gives them that opportunity. Hopefully they end up in those managerial positions and can help move this along with the next generation once Gen Alpha is in, and just have this sense of understanding, and also change anything around corporate social responsibility and what are our core missions and values, and be in a place where they're being paid well. Maybe they don't need to do as many side hustles, or maybe they only do the side hustles because they really want to and don't need to for profit. A place that teaches them. I think that that's a big thing, especially thinking about, we're so used to being a part of an institution our whole lives that helps you around like being taught, knowing, how to handle different things, and having that when, you grow up and go to school, and then if you decide to go to college. And I think that probably work could be that too, if you need a place where you can get additional opportunities, and also maybe help with like, all right, benefits is a big thing. I know Giselle mentioned that earlier. Like, let's have benefits that help with financial education and more, especially while we try to figure out this new world where things aren't like how it was when our parents were figuring out their lives and adulthood and things like that. So that's the big thing, I think, for me, just kind of a wraparound care. I know me, myself, as a Gen Zer, imagine my future career. I would love to be a part of a place where, okay, we can help you in many different ways and be proud to work here. And then also be able to close your laptop at the end of the day and have a really fulfilling life outside of work as well. And I think the two go hand in hand so much. I know people talk about work-life balance all the time, but I think they really are so related. If you feel comfortable at work, you feel supported there, you're gonna have nice time outside of work. So I think that's what I see.
Something that Giselle, were you going to jump in?
I mean, it's not that important, but I think it was just more so of like a +1 to that, Chloe. And I think summarizing that is, I think the future for them is a job that fully embraces and promotes your life outside of work. And I think like that's the thing. It's like, yes, you work, but we're empowering your personal life and we embrace it. It's okay. Because I think before Gen Z really kind of brought this to the forefront, those things were so separate and it was so taboo to even bring some of that into the workplace. So just agreeing with you, Chloe, completely.
Ivan, I hope you can take a stab at this last question. Oh, excuse me, take a pass this last question very quickly. Of course, Gen Z is one of the most diverse generations to ever enter the workforce. How do you meet the needs of a demographic that is so unique in its experiences on an individual level? We've talked about intersectionality a little bit here. How can employers think about meeting needs when those needs are going to be really individual?
The number one thing is that you need to know your audience. First, where is your talent and where are your customers? There should be a large overlap between those two groups. Second, I think you need to align your locality with the appropriate strategy. So if you're a US-focused organization, understand the landscape of available talent and customers. Look at publicly available demographic data from the Census Bureau, for example. And as you know, Giselle probably knows, in the recruiting world, right, there's a availability talent. And for organizations who are building, functional affirmative action plans, they have to understand, based on a regional picture, what is the reasonable goal for hiring for a particular demographic. So you have to be very realistic and use data for that. If you are a global organization where you have global customers and especially distributed workforces, you have to establish first and foremost a global perspective on inclusion. For example, in many parts of the world, there are particular isms that receive a lot more attention or that are much more prevalent. In the US, it might be racism. In other parts of the world, it might be sexism or nepotism or homophobia or whatever it is. And if you have a global workforce, then you need to establish a global position. And the way that I describe it is, at the end of all those isms, at the root, it's a balance. It's about an imbalance between power and privilege. That's it. So if you have a global DEI policy and program that's based on understanding and eradicating or lessening the imbalances in power and privilege between people groups, then that is the foundation for meeting the needs of a demographic that's becoming more and more varied.
We are at the top of the hour. I want to thank all of our panelists, Giselle, Chloe, and Ivan, for being here, being so generous with your knowledge and with your time. Thank you very much to our audience for being so active in the chat and in the Q&A. I really appreciate that. It's always nice to hear from folks who are attending and learning and contributing their own knowledge as well. And of course, thank you to Attuned for hosting this discussion. A recording of today's session will be available in a few days by email and on the Attuned website in a few days. That's attuned.ai. Thank you again so much, and be well.